She was called the Virgin Queen. To the people of England, Elizabeth I was untouchable, almost divine. Portraits painted her as radiant, her face white as ivory, her gowns glittering with pearls and gold. Courtiers bowed low, poets praised her beauty, and foreign ambassadors marveled at her commanding presence. To the world, she was the image of perfection, powerful, majestic, and flawless. Yet that was only what they were meant to see. Behind the closed doors of her palaces, away from the watchful eyes of the court, the truth was far less glamorous. Elizabeth lived in a time when medicine was primitive, and the standards of hygiene were nothing like ours today. Soap was rare, baths were feared, and perfumes were often used to mask odors rather than cleanse the body. Yet Elizabeth took these practices to another level, pushing the boundaries of filth in ways that would shock even her contemporaries. For all her elegance, the Queen hid revolting habits that revealed just how dark, dirty, and dangerous life inside a Tudor palace could be. And those secrets were carefully buried under layers of silk, powder, and ceremony, until whispers began to escape from servants and physicians who knew too much. One of the most disturbing truths was about her fear of water. Unlike most royals of her time, who at least bathed occasionally, Elizabeth believed that bathing could make her sick. She once remarked that she bathed only once a month. Whether I need it or not, imagine the most powerful woman in Europe, sitting on the throne of England, going weeks without cleaning herself. Sweat, dirt, and oils would build on her skin, while layers of perfume and heavy powders tried and failed to cover the stench. Even worse, her gowns were rarely washed. The same magnificent dresses seen in paintings often carried weeks of sweat and grime. Servants noted that the smell could fill entire rooms, but no one dared question their queen. In a world where appearances mattered more than reality, Elizabeth's beauty was a performance, and her courtiers were forced to play along. This was only the beginning of her hidden habits. What followed was stranger, dirtier, and in some cases, far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. For behind the glittering crown and the carefully painted face, Elizabeth I lived with disgusting practices that modern eyes would find unbearable. And the deeper we look, the more the illusion of her perfection begins to crumble. Because the Queen's filth was not just physical, it was also deadly. In portraits, Elizabeth I is often shown with closed lips or a faint controlled smile. Few ever saw her teeth clearly, and for good reason. Behind the painted image of elegance lay one of her most revolting secrets: her rotting black teeth. Sugar had just begun flooding into Europe during her reign. It was new, exotic, and dangerously addictive. Elizabeth adored it. Her sweet tooth was legendary. She consumed candied fruits, cakes, sugared almonds, and sweet wine in enormous quantities almost daily. What she didn't know was that sugar was slowly destroying her mouth. Dentists were crude in the 16th century, and there was no concept of brushing teeth to fight decay. Instead, sugar clung to her gums and teeth, feeding bacteria that rotted them from the inside out. By her later years, Elizabeth's teeth were black, crumbling, and foul-smelling. Courtiers whispered that her breath was unbearable, so much so that ambassadors struggled to stand close when speaking to her. One visitor from France even recorded his disgust, remarking that the Queen's teeth were very yellow and unequal. Her smile, once charming, became a mark of decay. To hide the damage, Elizabeth developed strange routines. She rubbed her teeth with cloths soaked in honey or vinegar, thinking it would clean them, but it only made things worse. Sometimes she stuffed her mouth with herbs to mask the odor. When the pain became unbearable, royal surgeons attempted extractions. But without anesthesia, the procedures were agonizing, and Elizabeth often refused them, preferring to live with the pain. The irony was cruel. Her love of sugar had been fueled by wealth and power, luxuries that most of her subjects could never dream of. Yet that same luxury left her mouth a wreck. In fact, her rotten teeth became such a defining feature of her reign that many English nobles began imitating her condition. Sugar was expensive and stained. Decaying teeth became a bizarre symbol of status. To look like the Queen, some even blackened their own teeth with soot. But the truth was far from glamorous. As Elizabeth aged, speaking grew painful, eating became difficult, and her breath could choke a room. Behind the royal mask of dignity, she was living with a mouth of decay that only grew worse as the years passed. And yet, this was only the second of her hidden horrors. While her teeth decayed, another filthy habit gnawed away at her skin, one that would leave her face scarred and caked in poisonous layers of makeup. Elizabeth I was celebrated as the Virgin Queen, her face the very image of pale, flawless beauty. To her subjects, she seemed untouched by time, a vision of purity preserved through divine grace. But the truth was far more sinister. That famous white complexion was not natural at all. It was painted on layer upon layer of toxic cosmetics that poisoned her skin and left her with a grotesque routine few dared to question. Her obsession began after surviving a deadly illness. In 1562, Elizabeth contracted smallpox. Though she recovered, the disease scarred her face, leaving pockmarks that she considered shameful. Terrified that her imperfections would damage her royal image, she turned to makeup to cover the scars. But her choice of cosmetics would slowly destroy her skin and her health. The Queen's favorite product was known as Venetian ceruse. It was a paste made of white lead mixed with vinegar, a deadly combination. Every morning, servants applied it thickly across her face, neck, and chest to achieve the ghostly pale look seen in her portraits. At first the effect was striking. She appeared radiant, almost otherworldly, but the poison was slowly eating away at her flesh. Lead-based cosmetics blocked her pores, caused swelling, and made her skin crack and bleed. Instead of removing it properly, Elizabeth piled on more layers to hide the damage. This became a vicious cycle. The more her skin deteriorated, the more makeup she applied. By her later years, courtiers reported that her face looked like a mask, stiff and unnatural, as if she were trapped beneath the very paint meant to glorify her. But the horror did not stop there. To remove the poisonous paste, Elizabeth used an equally revolting mixture: eggshells, alum, and mercury. These cleansers stripped her skin raw, leaving open wounds that made infection a constant threat. The mercury seeped into her bloodstream, worsening her health and possibly contributing to her erratic moods and declining strength. Her beauty, which had once been an asset to her rule, became a torment. Underneath the white mask, Elizabeth's face was ravaged, scarred, blistered, and aged beyond her years. Instead, painters carefully avoided showing her imperfections, ensuring that the myth of the flawless queen endured. This grotesque ritual, repeated day after day, shows the dark price of royal vanity in an age without science or medicine. Elizabeth's painted face became a symbol of power, but also of deception, hiding not only her scars, but the slow poisoning of her own body. And while her face was being destroyed by lead, another part of her hygiene was just as disturbing. For beneath her royal gowns, the Queen was hiding a habit so filthy it shocked even the servants who dressed her every day. To the outside world, Elizabeth I was a dazzling figure. Her gowns shimmered with jewels, her collars were stiff with lace, and her image in portraits was one of absolute majesty. Yet beneath those layers of silk and embroidery lurked one of the Queen's dirtiest secrets. She almost never washed her clothes. Laundry in the 16th century was a difficult, exhausting task, even for the royal household. Washing meant soaking garments in lye or urine, scrubbing them on boards and boiling them for hours. But Elizabeth's neglect went beyond inconvenience. She wore the same underclothes and gowns for weeks at a time, until they were stained with sweat, oils, and filth. Servants whispered that the smell could fill entire rooms, yet no one dared confront her. For to question the Queen's habits was to risk punishment or dismissal. Her magnificent dresses, the ones immortalized in paintings, often carried months of grime. The thick fabrics absorbed everything: body odor, food stains, even lice. And since these gowns were rarely, if ever, cleaned, the filth only grew. Instead of washing them, Elizabeth relied on perfumes and herbs, stuffing lavender or rosemary into her clothes to mask the stench. The result was an illusion of freshness, but the reality was unbearable. The Queen's undergarments, the linen shifts worn beneath her gowns, were meant to be changed daily. But Elizabeth often ignored this, keeping them on until they yellowed with sweat and dirt. Some accounts claim that when her ladies-in-waiting tried to persuade her to change, Elizabeth snapped in anger. She was, after all, the ruler of England. Who would dare tell her otherwise? This filth carried dangerous risks. dirty fabrics, trapped bacteria, fleas, and parasites. In an age where disease spread easily, Elizabeth's refusal to wash her clothes was more than disgusting. It was life-threatening. Ironically, while she prided herself on the cleanliness of her court compared to others in Europe, her own hygiene fell into shocking neglect. And yet her courtiers were trapped in the same nightmare. The grandeur of her court was carefully staged. Perfumes to mask odors, flowers scattered in chambers, and layers of fabrics designed to distract from the stench.
Ow.
But no matter how much wealth or ceremony surrounded her, the truth could not be erased. Elizabeth's gowns were, quite literally, rotting around her. As horrifying as this was, it was not the worst of her habits. For the filth clinging to her skin and clothing was one thing, but what she left behind in her private chambers revealed an even darker reality of royal life. Royal palaces in Tudor England were meant to dazzle foreign ambassadors and impress subjects with their grandeur. On the surface, they did. Towering halls, glittering tapestries, and lavish banquets made the court of Elizabeth I appear like the center of the world. But behind the heavy doors and beneath the polished floors, there was a revolting truth. The Queen's palaces stank. Sanitation in the 16th century was primitive at best, but Elizabeth's habits made matters worse. Her toilets, known as clostools, were little more than padded chairs with a hole in the center, beneath which sat a bucket. Servants were expected to empty and clean these buckets daily, but records revealed that they were often neglected for long stretches. The result was predictable: overflowing waste that reeked throughout the palace. Even worse, the palace plumbing, where it existed, was crude. Waste was funneled into pits or directly into the Thames River. During warm months, the stench was unbearable. Foreign visitors were horrified, describing a stench that clings to every chamber. Servants themselves joked bitterly that the Queen sat in state but not in cleanliness. Elizabeth's private chambers were no exception. She was notorious for refusing to leave her clothesstool, even when servants begged to clean it. At times, waste piled up until conditions were unspeakable. Her ladies-in-waiting, who were responsible for such tasks, often gagged while performing their duties. Still none dared complain. The filth did not stop at her private latrine. The palace grounds themselves became cesspits of human waste. In some castles, sewage seeped through walls and ran beneath corridors, leaving entire sections of the royal court nearly uninhabitable. Rats thrived, disease spread, and the smell was so overpowering that even courtiers accustomed to foul conditions remarked on its severity. Ironically, Elizabeth prided herself on order and majesty. She demanded elaborate rituals of cleanliness in her courtly etiquette: spotless floors before audiences, perfumed chambers before visitors. Yet in private, she tolerated filth of the worst kind. It was an open secret among her servants that the Queen's palaces were some of the dirtiest places in all of England. This final disgusting habit may be the most shocking of all, not only because of its foulness, but because it symbolized the duality of Elizabeth's reign. She was the face of elegance and power, yet behind closed doors, she lived surrounded by stench and decay. The Virgin Queen was, in truth, a monarch of filth. But there was something even darker hidden in these habits. For while her rotten teeth, poisoned skin, filthy gowns, and foul latrines shocked those closest to her, they also carried a deadly price. Slowly, these practices chipped away at her health, feeding rumors that the Queen was hiding more than just dirt. She was hiding her decline. By the final years of her reign, Elizabeth I no longer resembled the dazzling monarch immortalized in paintings. Beneath the crown and jewels, she was crumbling, physically and emotionally. Her filthy habits had not only disgusted her servants and courtiers, but had also begun to eat away at her health. And while no one dared speak it aloud, whispers grew louder. The Virgin Queen was rotting from the inside out. Her teeth, blackened and crumbling, left her unable to chew solid food. She relied heavily on broths and soft cakes, drenched in sweet wine, but even these caused her pain. When she spoke, her words were often slurred, and foreign envoys recorded their difficulty in understanding her. Her breath was so foul that audiences sometimes cut short their meetings, too polite to admit why. Her skin, poisoned by decades of lead-based cosmetics, began to peel and blister. The mask of youth she wore each day had become an actual mask, a thick white shell that cracked if she moved too much. Beneath it, her complexion was said to be mottled, scarred, and almost corpse-like. Servants described her as a figure who looked more like a painted statue than a living woman. Her clothes, worn for weeks without washing, trapped disease and parasites. The palace vermin thrived, and her personal chambers were infested with lice and fleas. In an age when epidemics swept through households with terrifying speed, Elizabeth's refusal to maintain cleanliness placed her life constantly at risk. And then there were her latrines. Waste accumulated in her chambers, and foul smells clung to her wherever she went. Chronic exposure to filth led to infections that weakened her body. Some historians now believe her hygiene habits may have worsened the illnesses she suffered in her later years. Constant fevers, skin eruptions, and perhaps even mercury poisoning from her cosmetic cleansers. The once vibrant queen who danced at court and dazzled foreign suitors became a shadow of herself. She withdrew from public view, hiding in her chambers, refusing to see visitors except under dim light. In the rare audiences she gave, she demanded that portraits and descriptions still portray her as youthful, beautiful, and divine. The reality, however, was far darker. A monarch ravaged by her own habits, clinging to a crumbling illusion. But the court could not ignore it forever. As her decline grew obvious, rumors spread across Europe that Elizabeth was no longer the radiant ruler of England, but a sickly, rotting figure kept alive by ceremony alone. The illusion of perfection was breaking, and with it, the image of her reign. And yet, even in her final years, Elizabeth's pride refused to let her show weakness. She chose to face her end in secrecy, surrounded by the stench, scars, and sickness her habits had created. By the turn of the 17th century, Elizabeth I was nearing 70, an astonishing age in an era when most people died decades earlier, yet her survival came at a terrible cost. Her years of vanity, filth, and secrecy had finally caught up with her. The once proud monarch who had ruled England with fiery speeches and sharp intelligence now spent her final months in a haze of pain, weakness, and decline. Her teeth, long blackened, had mostly rotted away. She could barely eat, surviving on soft foods and liquid broths. Servants whispered that she often wept in private after meals, clutching her jaw in agony. Her breath was unbearable, and courtiers avoided standing too close. Diplomats no longer described a radiant queen, but instead a frail, disfigured woman trying desperately to cling to dignity. Her skin, destroyed by decades of lead paint and mercury washes, had become ghostly. Behind the mask of white powder were scars, open sores, and sagging flesh. But Elizabeth could not abandon her ritual. Each day she demanded that layers of Venetian ceruse be smeared across her face until she resembled a living statue. By now, the makeup was not only hiding her scars, it was poisoning her body, feeding tremors, headaches, and confusion. Her body was failing. She had grown thin and restless, unable to sleep. Servants recorded that she would stand for hours without sitting, afraid that if she lay down, she would never rise again. Her gowns, still rarely washed, hung loosely on her frame, carrying the familiar stench that had haunted her court for years. Her chambers reeked of waste from neglected close stools, adding to the suffocating atmosphere. In her final weeks, Elizabeth refused to be seen in public. She rejected doctors, denied priests, and shut herself away in silence. Even her closest advisors found it difficult to approach her. They were greeted not by the dazzling virgin queen of legend, but by a frail, ghostly figure, her teeth gone, her face ravaged, her body weakened by years of filth and poison. And yet, even as she withered, Elizabeth refused to let the world see her weakness. She would not be remembered as broken or defeated. The myth of her beauty and majesty had to endure, no matter the cost. She ordered that her portraits still depict her as timeless, flawless, and divine. The truth of her decline remained hidden behind locked palace doors, sealed in the stench and shadows of her chambers. When she finally died in 1603, the image of Elizabeth I was still that of the glorious queen who had defeated the Spanish Armada, ruled without a husband, and shaped England's destiny. But those who had served her closest knew the darker truth. She had spent her last years consumed by her own filth, a prisoner of vanity and decay. When Elizabeth I died in March 1603, England mourned deeply. She had ruled for 45 years, steering the nation through war, religious turmoil, and political intrigue. To her people, she was not just a monarch, but a symbol of England's golden age. Bells tolled across London, and the streets filled with grief. But behind the public mourning was another story. The whispered truths about the Queen's final years of filth and decline. Those closest to her knew the reality. They had smelled her chambers, gagged while tending her close stools, and seen the sores hidden beneath her white mask of lead paint. They had watched her rot tooth by tooth as her vanity and fear of bathing left her body in a state of slow decay. Yet when it came time to write her legacy, these realities were erased. Elizabeth's court worked quickly to preserve her myth. Official portraits completed before her death depicted her as eternally youthful and flawless. Writers praised her intellect, her virginity, her command of armies and nations. No one dared describe the black teeth, the stinking gowns, or the poison on her skin. The Queen of Filth was transformed into the Gloriana, the radiant virgin queen who had ruled untouched by time. Even her funeral was staged as a spectacle of majesty. Dressed in regal finery, her body was placed on display, her face painted carefully one last time to hide the truth. Crowds who came to pay respects saw not the decayed woman she had become, but the idealized monarch she wanted them to remember. The deception was complete. Yet, whispers lingered. Guest ambassadors who had visited her in her final years quietly recorded the truth. Servants who had tended her filth passed stories down the generations. Over time, historians pieced together fragments of her revolting private life. Behind the official image of divine beauty was a monarch who had feared water, rotted her teeth with sugar, poisoned her skin with lead, allowed her gowns to fester with dirt, and tolerated latrines that stank like cesspits. What makes this story so disturbing is not only the filth itself, but how successfully it was hidden. Elizabeth ruled through image as much as policy. She knew that her strength depended on being seen as untouchable, ageless, and perfect. So she built her reign on illusion. The courtiers played along, the artists painted lies, and history repeated the myth. But beneath the crown and gowns, Elizabeth was a woman of flesh, weakness, and dirt. Her body carried the marks of her time, an era without modern medicine, without hygiene, and with dangerous ideas about beauty. She was not divine, she was human. And in that humanity, she was far filthier than most dared imagine. Today, Elizabeth I is remembered as one of England's greatest rulers, a queen who stood defiant against foreign enemies, who inspired an age of exploration, and who left behind a legacy of strength. Statues honor her, films glamorize her, and textbooks call her reign a golden age. Yet beneath the surface of that legend lies a disturbing truth. The virgin queen who projected divine majesty lived with habits that were revolting, even by the standards of her time. Her 5 most disgusting practices: bathing only once a month, rotting her teeth with sugar poisoning, her skin with lead, wearing unwashed gowns until they stank, and tolerating cesspits in her chambers, painted a hidden picture of filth. Together, they remind us that even the most powerful figures in history were human, bound by ignorance, vanity, and fear. These habits were not just personal quirks. They shaped how Elizabeth aged, how she ruled, and how she was remembered. Her refusal to bathe may have protected her from contaminated water, but it left her reeking. Her addiction to sugar created a smile that collapsed into blackened stumps, a grotesque irony for a queen obsessed with image. Her lead-based makeup turned her into a prisoner of her own mask, slowly poisoning her body. Her filthy gowns and stinking latrines turned her palaces into cesspits, breeding grounds for disease. And in her final days, these choices left her fragile, scarred, and broken. Even as her legend demanded she appear flawless. But perhaps the most chilling part of this story is not the filth itself, but how effectively it was hidden. Elizabeth's power rested on her ability to control perception. She understood that image could command loyalty, fear, and respect. So she built her reign on illusions, paintings that lied, rituals that dazzled, and courtiers who swallowed the stench in silence. She knew that truth would weaken her throne, and for centuries it worked. Only now, through the cracks of history, do we see the darker reality. Behind the glittering crown and jewels was a woman whose body was consumed by filth, vanity, and decay. The great virgin queen was not untouchable, not divine, not even clean. She was as human as the peasants who bowed before her, trapped in the same ignorance of medicine, hygiene, and mortality. And that is the unsettling legacy of Elizabeth I. Her reign may have shined like gold, but her body told another story. One of filth hidden beneath silk of rot behind a smile, and of a queen who spent her life fighting not only enemies abroad, but the decay within her own skin. The myth survived. The truth rotted away in silence.